I want to tell you a story about a miracle of biblical proportions, and it concerns God's chosen people, the Jews. Now, there are some churches that believe that when Jesus was rejected by the Jews, that God then rejected the Jews as his people, but that's not true. It goes all the way back to God's original promise to Abraham in Genesis chapter 17, where he said to Abraham, "Your descendants will always be my people, and the land of Canaan will be an everlasting possession of yours." Well, that was true when God brought the people of Israel into the promised land. But before they came in, Moses warned them in Deuteronomy chapter 29 that if you forsake the Lord, then God is going to bring a series of judgments against you to warn you to return to him. But if you continue to forsake the Lord, then God is going to bring about the final judgment, which will be exile from the land. And the land would begin to wither and die and not be able to support people. Well, the first major exile that took place in Jewish history took place at the time of Jeremiah. Jeremiah was the last prophet who was warning the people to stop forsaking the Lord, to return to him. He did it with tears even. He was so wrapped up in love for these people, and yet they continued to reject God and reject his message. And so he prophesied that the Babylonians would have them in exile for 70 years. But he also prophesied that they would not be totally forsaken by the Lord. Even though in Jeremiah chapter 31, they had forsaken the Lord, God would never reject them. They will never cease to be a nation, and the Jews would never cease to be their people. Well, this brings us up to the time of Jesus. You'll recall that Jesus had told his disciples when he was on the Mount of Olives that Jerusalem would be completely destroyed and the temple as well, and not one stone would be left upon another. He said that they, the Jews, will fall by the sword and will be taken prisoner to all the nations. And then that Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Well, here's the miracle. After almost 1900 years in exile, God restored the Jews to their land. He birthed a new nation of Israel with Jerusalem as its capital city. Well, how did that take place? How did God do all that? Well, let's go back to the time of Jesus. Some 35 years after he spoke these words of warning to the Jews rebelled against the Romans, and the Romans came and conquered the city in 70 AD. And they completely destroyed the city and exiled the Jews. After the exile, it took a couple of hundred years, but the land began to suffer the effects of a changing weather pattern. Years before, the Jews could count on an early rain and a latter rain, which would bring the crops into their fruition, and it became a bountiful area. But the early rains and the latter rains became intermittent, and they finally ceased altogether. It became such a barren place that people could not live there. Maybe some nomads and with their herds or whatever, but not many people could live there. It was so barren that by the time that Mark Twain came there in 1866, he remarked about how desolate the land was, that even cactus didn't grow there. The only city really that was around was Jerusalem. It only had 4,000 residents. It was just denuded of all vegetation. But God, soon afterwards, began to prepare his land for the miracle. Around 1880, 1890, around that time, the early rains and the latter rains returned with regularity to that nation. Secondly, God began to put in the hearts of the Jews a desire to return to their homeland. You see, they were persecuted wherever they went. And they endured such bad persecution that around 1890 or so, a man by the name of Theodor Herzl began a movement called Zionism, with its goal is to repopulate the Jews into Palestine and eventually perhaps even have their own nation. Well, that began to take place after World War I. The British were given the mandate over the land of, it was called Palestine, or they called it Palestine actually. It wasn't called anything before when the Turks owned it, because it was so devoid of people. The British began to allow the Jews to come and resettle in small numbers into that land. So they came in a small trickle, but it wasn't until the worst persecution that ever happened occurred with Adolf Hitler's Holocaust. Some 6 million Jews died. That's 2 out of every 3 Jews that lived in Europe. After the war was over, they had nowhere to go except to go to Palestine. And so one way or another, they made it there. And by 1948, they declared for the first time in 2,000 years, the independent nation of Israel. They didn't quite have Jerusalem fully until 1967, when there was another war and they reconquered the old city of Jerusalem, and it is now their capital, recognized by the United States of America in 2019. So now Jerusalem is no longer trodden underfoot by the Gentiles, and the time of the Gentiles is fulfilled. Let's find out what happens next in our next session.